The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of angry insects, and Brooke Sullivan moved through them as if they weren't there at all. She pushed the med cart down the darkened corridor of Oak Creek Memorial's ICU, her scrubs navy blue and worn soft at the elbows, her badge clipped to a faded lanyard that had seen better years. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath that sea copper, maybe, or the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through ventilator circuits for too long. The night shift started at 2,100 hours. Brooke was always exactly 3 minutes early. Nobody noticed her arriving. That was the point. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a skill like any other. You moved in straight lines. You kept your eyes on the monitor banks and the charts, never on faces. You answered questions with the minimum number of words. You thanked people for giving you more work. You absorbed criticism without flinching, without the small tells that made bullies escalate, no jaw clench, no sharp intake of breath, no tremor in your hands when someone raised their voice. Just a measuring breath. Just a nod. Just keep moving. In the 12 years since she had stopped being the person she actually was, Brooke had perfected the art of disappearing into any institution that would hire her. The ICU had 24 beds. Tonight, 18 were full. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms in perfect 6-beat patterns, and the monitors beeped their steady countdowns. Room 407 was at the end of the west corridor, and that was where Captain Marcus Webb lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling with the metronome regularity of forced respiration. He had been airlifted from Baghdad 72 hours ago, and his injuries required documentation Brooke had learned not to ask questions about. Shrapnel wounds. Collapsed lungs. A compound fracture of the tibia that had required 18 pins and a full surgical team. The paperwork said he was stable. The monitors said something different. Brooke moved to his bedside and performed the assessment she had performed 10,000 times before. She placed 4 fingers along the anterior neck, below the angle of the jaw, at the level of the cricoid cartilage. Her fingers found the exact anatomical position without looking, muscle memory, she told herself, the kind you got from textbooks and YouTube videos, not from the kind of training that left you unable to ever talk about where you had actually learned it. The trick here was centered. No deviation. The pulse beneath was steady, 68 beats per minute, the systolic pressure maintained by the pressors running in his right radial line. She checked the ventilator settings. Mode, assist control. Rate, 12 breaths per minute. PEEP at 5 centimeters water pressure. Everything was exactly as it should be, which meant nothing, because what it should be was not the same as what it would be in 48 more hours when the infection would start and the attending physicians would begin the long, quiet process of giving up. She had seen it before. She would see it again. The medic found her outside room 407, and she knew immediately that something had shifted. His name tag read Chen, and his bearing carried the particular exhaustion of someone rotating through post-deployment duty, spending his days watching other people recover from wounds while his own body slowly convinced him that he was no longer young. When she reached for the 4-bag to change the saline drip, his eyes tracked her hands, and she felt something in the air between them change pressure, like a storm front rolling in. That hand placement, Chen said quietly. Not a question. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular. That's not standard assessment. Brooke continued her work without breaking rhythm. The saline bag clicked into place. She adjusted the drip rate with 2 fingers, precise, economical. Most nurses use 2 fingers. Forgives better tactile feedback. That's not where I saw it before. Chen's voice had dropped. He was close enough now that she could smell the ghost of diesel exhaust on his uniform jacket, Baghdad dust, probably, or Kandahar, or one of the dozens of forward operating bases where the Rael medicine happened without benefit of air conditioning or sterile fields. That hand position. I saw a medic do it exactly like that during a casevac in Fallujah. Triage sorting on a Chinook flight deck. She was assessing 8 guys in 9 minutes, using 4-finger placement on all of them, and not one of them died en route. Brooke did not pause. She did not turn to face him. She moved to the next line, the one running into his left antecubital fossa, and began documenting the vital signs in the chart. Her handwriting was small and precise, each number aligned perfectly in its box. "That's a good medic." She was more than a medic. Chen's voice had taken on a quality now, something like recognition. She was something else entirely. "Had this patch, I remember, because it was so faded you could barely see it, sewn inside her flight jacket. 75th Ranger Regiment." I asked her about it, and she smiled and never answered the question. Brooke's hand paused for exactly 2 seconds on the pen. 2 seconds. Not 1, not 3. 2 seconds, because 1 would seem reactive and 3 would seem defensive. She continued writing without looking up. The way she had learned, the way you survived in institutions where being noticed was dangerous. Dr. Sterling was watching from the nurse's station when she finished charting. She felt his gaze the way you felt humidity before a storm, a thickness in the air, a pressure change. He was tall, the kind of man who had never developed the particular posture of people who spent time inside tight helicopters or behind the breaches of buildings, and his white coat hung on him like something imported from a magazine spread about what doctors were supposed to look like. His hands were soft. His nails were manicured. He had a Rolex on his wrist that cost more than Brooke made in 3 months, and when he looked at her, she saw something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe, or suspicion, or the particular anger of a man who had just realized that something in his carefully managed ecosystem was not quite what it appeared to be. He had been watching her for 3 days now. She had felt it from the first shift he assigned her to Captain Webb's care. It was not the normal attention of a attending physician supervising a new nurse. It was the attention of someone who was studying you, the way a cardiologist studies an EKG, looking for the anomaly that didn't match the expected pattern. Brooke knew why. She had seen the billing codes in the open chart at the nursing station, just a glimpse, just enough to understand that there were phantom procedures logged, charges for interventions that had never been performed, CVA assessments for patients who had been unconscious since admission, intracranial pressure readings that didn't match any physical monitor she could see on the equipment. In every hospital, there was someone running small crimes through the gaps. In this one, it was Sterling, and he had realized that Brooke had noticed. The night nurse supervisor called her over at 2,247 hours. His name was Patterson, and he had the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running this unit for 15 years and was too tired to maintain the filters that separated his personal opinions from his professional voice. "We need to talk about your charting on Captain Webb," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. Dr. Sterling flagged some documentation issues. "Says your assessments are missing standard notations. Not inaccurate, necessarily. Just incomplete." Brooke had prepared for this. She had known it was coming. She had seen the calculation in Sterling's face when he realized what she represented, not a threat to him, exactly, not yet, but the possibility of a threat. So he was starting small. Building a file. Creating a paper trail that would make it easy for him to dismiss her later when he had secured his position and ensured that any accusations she might make would be buried under a foundation of documented incompetence. "I can expand the documentation," Brooke said quietly. "Whatever format the department requires." "Just be thorough," Patterson said, and she heard the apology in his voice. He knew what was happening. Maybe he had even warned Sterling against it, or maybe he was complicit, it didn't matter. This was how institutions protected themselves. They swallowed the people who noticed, one small action at a time. She worked through the rest of the shift with a meticulous attention to detail that would have been impossible to critique. Every chart entry was complete. Every assessment was documented with maximum detail. She noted vital signs at intervals more frequent than required. She recorded the position of every line and monitor lead. By 0600 hours, when the day shift arrived and the ICU began its transition from the quiet intensity of night to the controlled chaos of day, her documentation was impeccable. But Sterling was already moving. She could see it in the way he distributed assignments, in the small comments he made to other staff members just loud enough for her to hear. New nurse still getting oriented. Some of these charts need clarification. Not quite ready for independent assessment yet. The pattern was forming. The narrative was being constructed. Captain Webb slept through all of it, his sedation maintained at perfect levels, his vitals stable on paper even though Brooke could hear something else in the timing of his heartbeat, an arrhythmia beginning to whisper itself into existence, something that would grow over the next 48 hours unless someone intervened in ways that Sterling would never allow, not for a patient he had already begun calculating as a write-off. She finished her charting at 0705 hours, as the day shift nurse, a woman named Rodriguez with kind eyes, came in to relieve her. "How was he?" Rodriguez asked, checking the monitor herself. "Stable," Brooke said. "Pressors holding. Monitors clean." She paused, and then the words came out almost before she could stop them. "But watch for early arrhythmias. He's developing something. It's subtle, but it's there." Rodriguez checked the EKG strip. "Looks good to me." "In about 36 hours, Brooke said quietly. "The sinus rhythm will start to fracture." She didn't stay to explain. She never did. She clocked out at exactly 0730 hours and walked to her truck, a 2009 Tacoma with 247,000 miles and a fading sticker on the rear bumper that had been half stripped away decades ago, leaving only the outline of something that might have been a unit insignia. The Denver dawn was cold and clear, October turning toward November, and the city looked clean and temporary in the early light, the way all cities did when you were someone nobody knew, moving through them like a shadow on water. She sat in the truck for 5 minutes without turning on the engine, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes on the hospital rising above the parking lot like something made of bone. Somewhere in there, Dr. Sterling was beginning his day, already thinking about his next move. Somewhere in there, Captain Webb was sleeping the medicated sleep of someone whose body was healing while his mind lived in a different place entirely. Somewhere in there, Chen was probably processing what he had seen in her hand placement, the recognition he had almost spoken aloud. She had built 12 years of invisibility. She had taken a new name in her mind and a different version of herself in her paperwork. She had taken a job where she could save lives without anyone knowing that she had been trained to do exactly that in conditions that would break most people, and she had done it well. But invisibility, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as safety. She turned on the engine and drove home through the dawn, and did not look back. The sun hadn't cleared the mountains when Brooke pulled into Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot on Tuesday morning. She'd driven home through the dawn, hand steady on the wheel despite the tremor in her shoulders, and spent the hours between shifts staring at her apartment ceiling, replaying the way Sterling's eyes had tracked her movements in Captain Webb's room. Invisibility had always been her armor. Now it was beginning to feel like a tomb. The ICU doors opened to the familiar antiseptic smell, the low hum of ventilators already in their rhythm. The night shift had been unremarkable, vital signs stable. No new admits, no crises. Sterling had barely acknowledged her during rounds, which should have felt like a reprieve. It didn't. Charge Nurse Patterson caught her at the station. "Dr. Sterling wants you at the unit board. Now." Brooke checked the patient monitor for Captain Webb, oxygen at 98%, heart rate steady at 62, and walked to the front of the unit. The board was a whiteboard where the team posted updates, assignments, and occasionally, when someone really needed the whole world to know, public censure. Sterling stood there with a red marker in one hand, and beside him stood a woman Brooke recognized from the chart, Captain Webb's mother, a Gold Star mother, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had already buried enough grief. Next to her was a girl, maybe 12, with her father's dark eyes. Emma. His daughter. The room went quiet. 5 nurses stopped charting. An aide froze mid-stride. Sterling's voice carried across the ICU with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. "Nurse Sullivan, your documentation on Captain Webb's medication administration has shown a troubling pattern of improper charting. Specifically, you've noted administration times at variance with the protocol I established." He squeaked the marker loudly against the whiteboard. Under the header Disciplinary Issues, he wrote her name in letters large enough that every corner of the unit could read it. "This kind of sloppiness endangers our heroes. It's unacceptable." Emma's face crumpled. The girl's hand reached for her grandmother's arm, and Brooke watched the woman's jaw tighten as she tried to smile reassurance at her granddaughter. Brooke took one measured breath. The kind of breath trained into her across 3 deployments. One breath. Then she spoke, her voice level and quiet enough that only Sterling and the family would hear. I documented at administration time per protocol, Doctor. The timestamps reflect the exact moment the medication entered the fall line. That's the standard. Sterling's smile could have cut glass. Are you contradicting my judgment in front of a patient's family, Nurse Sullivan? She said nothing. She would not give him the performance he was hunting for. She wiped a single tear that had escaped her right eye without breaking his gaze, and in that gesture, she made her choice. She would not break, not here, not for him. Then she turned back to the monitors and resumed her shift. Emma watched her the entire time, something like recognition flickering across the girl's face before her grandmother gently steered her toward Captain Webb's room. Wednesday morning came fast. Brooke sat at the break room table with her lunch, a turkey sandwich and an apple, the same meal she'd brought for 3 weeks. The table where she'd sat while the nurses talked around her, nothing sharp, nothing direct. Just the ambient coldness of deliberate exclusion. All 7 staff nurses grabbed their lunch containers simultaneously. It was choreographed. Patterson whispered loudly as she walked past, her voice designed to carry. Can't trust Charity case with anything important. Probably forged those references anyway. The door closed behind them. Brooke sat alone, fork steady in her hand despite the tremor that wanted to live in her jaw. She'd eaten alone in desert dining facilities while bombs fell outside the wire. She could eat alone in a break room. She cut the sandwich into precise halves and did not think about the way her fingers had once performed sutures by flashlight in a MRAP that was trying very hard to become a coffin. Thursday brought a new assignment. Sterling had reworked the schedule. Brooke was moved exclusively to isolation rooms, COVID holds, C. difficile cases, the rooms where patients were placed behind closed doors and the machines did most of the work. The rooms where no one would witness her competence. No one would see her adjust ventilator settings with the precision of someone who'd managed respiratory failure in field conditions. No one would notice her catch a subtle shift in cardiac rhythm that would have been missed by a resident still learning to read a monitor. By Friday morning, Sterling had escalated beyond schedule manipulation. He was hunting something specific. He came into Captain Webb's room at 1400 hours, when Brooke was changing the captains for dressing. The patient was semi-conscious, drifting in the space between sedation and awareness. Specialist Chen was there, rotating through post-deployment duty. Respiratory therapist Martinez was adjusting the ventilator. All witnesses. All audience. Sterling's voice filled the room like poison gas. This is what happens when we hire nurses with suspicious gaps in their employment history. No references. No explanation. Most likely got fired from her last 3 hospitals for similar negligence. He stepped closer to the monitor as if reading the vital signs rather than making a point. I should never have approved this hire. It was against my better judgment, and now we're seeing why. Brooke's hands clenched once at her sides. Once. Then she released. She felt the heat rising in her chest, the kind of heat that comes from swallowed words, from anger locked behind her teeth like ammunition in a magazine. One tear traced down her left cheek. She wiped it carefully, deliberately, and met Sterling's eyes with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst thing the world can do to you. I've survived worse reviews, Doctor. The words were soft. They were ice. Sterling leaned closer, his smile widening. Not from me, you haven't. The attending physician, Dr. Mehta, looked away. Specialist Chen's eyes had widened suddenly, his mouth opening as if he'd just recognized someone he knew from another lifetime, but Brooke was already moving, back to her work, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, in places that didn't exist on maps, under circumstances that official channels would have denied. Captain Webb's monitors beeped steadily in the silence after Sterling left. A rhythmic pulse. A man still fighting. A rhythm that said not yet, not today, Not on this man's watch. Brooke adjusted the ventilator settings with the kind of precision that made it look effortless, a small increase in positive end expiratory pressure, a fractional change in FiO2 that only someone trained in critical care during combat operations would have considered necessary. The kind of adjustment that kept a patient breathing when the margins between living and dying were measured in millimeters. Martinez glanced at her once, then back at the screen. "Nice catch." Brooke didn't respond. She was already thinking about Saturday night, about the way tension pneumothorax presented, about the specific angle required for needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She was thinking about the 14-gauge catheter she kept in her scrub pocket, the one she'd carried for 6 years. The one she'd never stopped believing she might need. But that wasn't the worst part of Friday. The worst part came at shift change, when she found the isolation room assignment for Saturday night, 12 hours of SIA difficile holds and COVID patients and the complete absence of anyone who might notice if something went catastrophically wrong. She reviewed Captain Webb's vitals one final time before leaving. Oxygen saturation 98%. Heart rate steady. Blood pressure holding at 118/72. The perfect picture of stability. The picture of a man Sterling had already decided was non-viable, was a waste of resources, was a resource allocation issue rather than a human being. Brooke gathered her things and walked out into the Denver evening, where the sun was painting the mountains the color of old blood. She didn't know that at 5:02 on Saturday morning, Captain Webb's oxygen saturation would begin dropping. She didn't know that Sterling had already made 3 phone calls to department heads, spreading the word about this patient, about the futility, about the resource drain. She didn't know that 15 doctors would spend the next hour either refusing the case entirely or starting procedures and abandoning them the moment they saw Sterling's notations about non-viable patients and questionable benefit. She only knew that when the emergency came, she would be ready. And she only knew that her survival, and the captain's, would depend on whether the rest of the hospital was willing to let him die. The monitor's beeping accelerated at 0245, a rhythm that shifted from routine to urgent. Brooke caught it first, the way the sound climbed half an octave during her rounds through the ICU sleeping corridor. Captain Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation numbers on the screen ticked downward like a countdown timer nobody else was watching. 78%. 75. 72. The numbers didn't lie, and Brooke had learned years ago that the first person to read the truth in a monitor was usually the only person who could act on it. She moved to his bedside without rushing. The captain lay motionless under the ventilator's mechanical breathing, still sedated from the transport from Baghdad, his body cataloguing injuries that hadn't yet finished their damage report. Brooke's hands moved through the assessment she'd performed 1,000 times before, hands that had once held a man's intestines in place during a sandstorm, hands that had felt for a carotid pulse in a darkness so complete it felt like blindness. Those hands now pressed gently against the captain's left chest wall. Asymmetrical. His right side rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. His left side remained still, unnaturally flat, as though that entire half of his body had decided to stop breathing. She palpated the space between his ribs, feeling for the landmarks her training had burned into muscle memory. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingertips found the trachea, and there it was. The deviation. The trachea had shifted, sliding leftward like a compass needle pulled toward something terrible. The neck veins were distended, swollen, fighting against pressure building inside the chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the space between the lung and the chest wall, compressing his heart, collapsing his ability to fill with blood. For minutes like this, maybe 5. Then cardiac arrest. The ICU was a ghost town at this hour. Night shift meant skeleton crew, just Brooke, 2 nursing aides in the other wing handling post-op recovery, and Dr. Kim, the resident who'd drawn the unlucky assignment of covering the 4 patient beds while the attending physician slept in houses with mortgages and wine collections. Sterling had positioned Dr. Kim carefully over the past weeks, made sure everyone knew he was uncertain, deferential, not to be consulted on anything that mattered. The young doctor was good. Brooke had watched him, had seen the careful thinking behind his eyes, but he'd learned the first rule of survival in academic medicine: don't contradict your seniors. Brooke pressed the call light and walked to find him. The resident's on-call room was 2 corridors down, and she found Dr. Kim at the desk in the break room, eyes half closed over a stack of charts that he was reading without absorbing. He looked up when she appeared, and something in her face made him stand before she'd spoken a single word. Captain Websat is dropping. Tracheal deviation. Distended neck veins, she said. 10 words, each one a data point, each one a piece of the puzzle that only made sense if you understood how to read it. Tension pneumo. The young resident's face went pale. Sterling said. I know what he said. They moved back to the captain's room together, and Brooke began her preparation. The supplies were already in her mind. She'd memorized the ICU's layout on her first night, had memorized where everything lived the way a person who'd never planned to stay in one place for long memorized emergency exits. 14-gauge catheter. Angiocath needle. She pulled them from the crash cart without ceremony, without asking permission. Her movements were precise, economic, the movements of someone whose hands had learned to trust what her brain already knew. The oxygen saturation ticked lower. 70. 68. The monitor's beeping had become a kind of scream, a mechanical alarm calling out the emergency that Sterling's refusal to act was creating. Dr. Kim stood at the foot of the bed, helpless and hovering, the way residents learned to stand when they were terrified of making a mistake that someone more senior would use against them. His SAT's at 65, Dr. Kim whispered. We need to call. There's no one to call, Brooke said. The words weren't cruel. They were just true. Sterling had already called the first wave. She'd heard him in the hallway earlier, phone in hand, working through the list of specialists with the precision of a man executing a plan. The trauma surgeon who'd treated the captain had taken an emergency trip to a conference in Phoenix. The thoracic surgeon was unavailable. The ICU attending wasn't answering. The on-call cardiologist had said his wife needed him home, his mother-in-law was having a crisis, he couldn't come in. 8 doctors had said no or not available or I can't. Sterling had made sure of it, had placed strategic calls, had mentioned complications that didn't exist, had painted the captain as a resource drain, a non-viable admission, a case that would tank their mortality statistics. Brooke had been in the hospital long enough to see the pattern. She'd watched Sterling work. She understood now that this wasn't random refusal, this was architecture. This was a man whose billing codes the captain's injuries had exposed, whose phantom procedures and inflated charges and coded procedures for patients who would never notice or complain had suddenly become visible to a nurse who shouldn't have had clearance to see those numbers in the first place. Sterling couldn't remove her through normal channels, not directly. But he could create a situation where she was so isolated, so unsupported, so deliberately starved of backup that when the emergency came, and Sterling probably hadn't expected the emergency to come this soon, this violently, she would be alone. And when she failed, he would have his papers, his incident reports, his testimony from 7 nurses who had been trained to exclude her. What Sterling hadn't calculated was that some emergencies didn't wait for convenience. Some emergencies arrived at 02:45 on a Saturday morning when the hospital was sleeping and the medical chain of command was conveniently unavailable. Brooke's hand found the spot. The needle position was muscle memory. She could have done this in darkness, in sand, in rain, in the chaos of a burning vehicle. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Just above the 3rd rib. The needle would go through skin, through fascia, through the intercostal muscles. It would pierce the parietal pleura with a sensation like puncturing a balloon. And then the hiss, that was the indicator, the confirmation, the sound of pressure releasing, air escaping, the pneumothorax collapsing back into normal, giving the lungs and heart room to expand again. But before she could move, Specialist Chen appeared in the doorway. He was wearing physical therapy gear, rumpled and worn from sleeping in the family lounge beside the captain's bed. He'd been there since the emergency transport, had refused to leave, had told Brooke during one of her rounds that the captain was his brother-in-arms, that they'd served together in Mosul, that he wasn't leaving until he knew the captain would make it. Brooke had liked him immediately, had recognized in him the same thing that Sterling probably sensed in her, some quality that marked a person as having lived in a place where decisions happened in seconds and you either moved or you didn't. Chen saw the needle in Brooke's hand. He saw the position of her fingers, the angle of her body, the setup that only someone trained in tactical combat medicine would recognize. He saw the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, which had shifted when she'd moved quickly, which she'd had to adjust back into place so many times that the stitches had become loose and frayed. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened. Something that looked like recognition and shock and sudden understanding crashed across his face all at once. "Holy shit," he breathed. "You." The door to the ICU corridor swung open. Dr. Sterling stood framed in the entrance, his face flushed with the particular anger of a man who'd just gotten off a phone call and was riding that adrenaline, that rage, that sense of control reasserting itself. He'd been making calls all night. Brooke had heard him from the break room, heard the careful cadence of his voice as he worked through the list of specialists, as he planted seeds about the captain's condition being futile, as he made sure that when she made her inevitable mistake, there would be no one to contradict him about what had happened. "Nurse Sullivan," Sterling said, and his voice was the voice of a man who'd finally maneuvered himself into the position he'd been building toward. "Step away from that patient. You're suspended effective immediately. Security is on the way. You have no authority to perform any intervention. Step away." The monitor screamed. 62%. The captain's heart rate was climbing past 140, climbing like it was trying to run away from the failing oxygen supply. The blood pressure was collapsing, 95/60, then 90/55, the numbers dropping like they were falling downstairs. For minutes was theoretical. For minutes was when a person with stable injuries would begin to crash. For minutes was a guideline. The captain had maybe two. Brooke pulled the 14-gauge catheter from her pocket in one smooth motion. She'd kept it there for 3 weeks, ever since Dr. Kim had made a comment about the ICU stock being low, ever since she'd done the calculations in her head and understood that when the emergency came, if the emergency came, there wouldn't be time to search for supplies. There wouldn't be time to ask Sterling for permission or wait for him to refuse. There would only be time to move. She positioned the needle at the exact spot where anatomy and physics intersected. Second intercostal space. The space where a needle could go in and change everything. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Brooke moved before Sterling finished his sentence, her hands already steady on the 14-gauge catheter she kept in her pocket, the same needle that had saved lives in sandstorms, in darkness, under fire. Captain Webb's oxygen saturation was 76 and dropping. His trachea had shifted hard to the right, a visible bulge pushing against the skin of his neck. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of injury that killed men in seconds if you hesitated. Sterling grabbed her arm. "Step back. Now." She didn't step back. She stepped forward. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, perpendicular to the chest wall. One motion. No trembling. The sensation was like pushing through canvas. Then the hiss, that unmistakable hiss of air escaping under pressure. The sound of a man's chest cavity decompressing. Of death stepping backward. Captain Webb's trachea shifted back to midline. His color changed in real time, the gray-blue fading from his lips. The heart monitor accelerated, then steadied into something resembling a rhythm. His SAT climbed. 78%. 82%. 87%. His chest rose symmetrically again, both sides expanding like he was remembering how to breathe. He gasped. A deep, shuddering breath that pulled his whole body upward for 3 seconds. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, confused. Then closed again. Alive. The room went dead silent. Dr. Kim stood frozen, her hand still mid-air from where she'd been preparing to call time of death. Specialist Chen whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, that was a combat technique. Only special operations medics. Sterling's face went white, then red. He grabbed Brooke's arm hard enough to bruise, his fingers digging into the muscle above her elbow. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She simply looked at him with the flat, empty stare of someone who had absorbed worse than anger. You assaulted a patient against direct orders. His voice shook. Not from grief. From rage. From the understanding that something he could not control had just happened in his ICU. You're finished. Not just here. I'll make sure you never work in medicine again. He pulled his phone out with his other hand and made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one shorter than the last, each one designed to methodically dismantle her. First call went to Patricia Yates, a board member who owed Sterling for covering up her son's DUI arrest and the falsified medication documentation that followed. I need a nurse investigated for credentialing fraud and dangerous practice. Immediately. Yates didn't ask questions. She had too much to lose. Second call went to Colorado State Nursing Board, the official line, the one that left a record. I'm reporting a dangerous practitioner with a suspicious employment gap. Possible falsified records. Name is Brooke Sullivan. The intake coordinator took notes. Protocol demanded it. Third call went to the private investigator Sterling kept on permanent retainer, a man named Marcus Graves who specialized in background checks for people with something to hide. I need a full background on Brooke Sullivan. 5 years. Everything. And I need it in 4 hours. Graves said, you'll have it in 3. Brooke stood silent through all 3 calls, her arms at her sides, her breathing steady. The tears would come later, not here. Not where Sterling could see them. Not where it mattered. She had been trained in too many places, by too many people, to break in front of her enemy. By 0600, Graves arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a preliminary report printed on 5 sheets of cream-colored paper. He handed it to Sterling in the hospital administrator's office, where the door was closed and no one could see. Ghost identity, Graves said, tapping the second page. No nursing school records before 5 years ago. No prior addresses you can trace. References that were created but don't check out. A social security number that belongs to a woman who legally changed her name. He paused. Whoever she was before, she doesn't exist anymore. That kind of work takes resources. Government resources. Sterling's hands trembled as he read the report. Not from fear of Brooke. From fear of what Brooke represented. A person the government had made disappear. A person the government was protecting. A person he had just tried to destroy. He made another call anyway, because backing down meant admitting he'd made a mistake, and backing down meant giving her power. Security. I need a nurse escorted from the building. Brooke Sullivan. ICU. Terminated. Now. It was 0630 when security arrived at Brooke's side, 2 guards in Navy uniforms with the apologetic expressions of men following orders they didn't understand. We need you to come with us, Sam. Brooke handed over her badge without argument. The plastic caught the fluorescent light as it changed hands. She collected her jacket from her locker, the same jacket with the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside the lining, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. She didn't say goodbye to Dr. Kim or Specialist Chen or any of the nurses who had treated her like she didn't belong. She simply walked to the parking garage and drove away from Oak Creek Memorial as the sun was coming up over the Denver skyline. Captain Webb stabilized without her. Of course he did. The immediate crisis was resolved. He was transferred to a regular ICU bed by afternoon, extubated by evening. Emma visited and asked her father's new nurse, "Where's the lady who was always here?" "The one who came in at night." The nurse said, "I'm not sure, sweetheart. She doesn't work here anymore." Emma didn't ask again. 72 hours later, Brooke sat in the waiting room of the Denver VA hospital with a clipboard in her hands and a form that asked for her name, her date of birth, her chief complaint. Around her sat men and women she recognized, veterans she had treated in another life, when she wore a uniform, when her rank meant something, when people saluted instead of dismissed. One caught her eye and started to speak, then stopped, confused. The recognition was there, but the context was broken. She was a patient now. A ghost in scrubs. She checked the box marked veteran and wrote anxiety, depression under chief complaint, and felt the weight of invisibility crushing her chest more thoroughly than any pneumothorax ever could. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was still there. Still billing fraudulent procedures. Still pressuring doctors to abandon expensive cases. Still destroying anyone who noticed. And Brooke was gone. Officially erased. The one person who could have stopped him was now sitting in a VA waiting room as a patient, waiting for an intake interview that would take 3 hours and solve nothing. The sound arrived exactly 72 hours after she walked out of Oak Creek Memorial. A Chinook helicopter. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of military rotors beating air, loud enough to rattle windows, loud enough to stop conversations mid-sentence. The helicopter descended toward the rooftop helipad at 0630 on the 4th day, rotors still spinning, and the entire hospital felt the pressure change, the way the air itself becomes heavier when authority arrives unannounced. 2 Navy officers in dress whites emerged first. Ribbons covered their chests in neat rows. Silver insignia caught the morning sun. Behind them came a SEAL team leader in fatigues, his bearing so perfect it looked like someone had carved him out of oak and taught him to walk. They moved through the hospital corridors with the kind of purpose that made nurses step aside without being asked. They went directly to the ICU. The lead officer, a commander with silver hair and eyes like winter, looked at Charge Nurse Patterson and said, "We're looking for Senior Chief Sullivan." "Where is she?" Patterson's face went blank. We don't have anyone by that rank. We had a Brooke Sullivan, but she was Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Navy. The commander's voice was quiet. Soft, even. That kind of soft that makes people listen harder than they would to shouting. The ICU went still. The ventilators kept hissing. The monitors kept beeping. But the people stopped moving. Captain Webb's daughter Emma appeared from her father's room, red-eyed from 6 hours of bedside vigil. The commander turned to her without explanation and handed her a manila folder. Inside was a service record. Official seals. Photographs in uniform. Dates that didn't make sense because the dates were classified, redacted in thick black ink. "Your father woke up this morning," the commander said. "First time since he was airlifted from Baghdad. First words he spoke were about a nurse. He described her technique. Described it in military terms. Only one person we know could have done what he described." He nodded at the folder. "Would you read the summary, please?" Emma's hands shook as she opened the file. The paper felt expensive. Official. The kind of document that changes how you understand a person. Her voice cracked as she read aloud, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Service record, classified." Her eyes moved down the page. "It says?" Her voice broke completely. "It says she's a hero. It says she pulled 11 men from a burning vehicle under fire. It says she looked up at the SEAL leader with tears streaming down her face. Who is she?" Charge Nurse Patterson took the file from Emma's trembling hands. She read silently, her lips moving without sound over each citation. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Another Bronze Star with Valor. And then, a pause. A longer reading. A whisper that barely escaped her throat, Navy Cross. She earned a Navy Cross. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had carried the bodies of his own men. "Senior Chief Sullivan was attached to my team for operations that officially never happened. When the MRAP hit an IED and the fuel tank ruptured, she went in 3 times while rounds were incoming. 3 of my men are alive because of her. Another 8 Rangers from a separate vehicle." He paused. Her call sign was Lifeline. Specialist Chen pushed through the crowd, face white as paper. The 4-finger tracheal assessment. That's taught in the 75th Ranger Regiment medical pipeline. You learn that in combat medicine, not in standard nursing school. I thought, but she's Navy. Cross-trained, the SEAL leader said. Multi-service special operations. Her official record was scrubbed after the Ramadi operation because the operation was buried. We told her to disappear. She obeyed orders. She always obeyed orders. Dr. Sterling appeared from his office, his face going through every color between white and gray. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The SEAL leader turned to him, and Sterling visibly reconsidered whatever he had been about to say. Who fired her? The commander's voice was still soft. Somehow worse than shouting. Sterling stammered. There were irregularities in her. Who fired her? Silence stretched across the ICU like something with weight. Dr. Kim, the young resident, spoke quietly from where she stood near the medication dispensary. Dr. Sterling did. After she saved Captain Webb's life. 15 doctors refused the case. 15. Some walked away mid-code. Some told Captain Webb's family he was non-viable. She was the only one who actually tried. The commander's jaw tightened. And where is Senior Chief Sullivan now? Patterson whispered, we don't know. The SEAL leader looked at the commander. Something passed between them, something wordless and final. The kind of understanding that comes from having made decisions in places where deciding wrong meant burying your men. Find her, the commander said. By the time the Navy officers stepped into the ICU hallway, Dr. Sterling was already running. Not running physically, that would have been too obvious, but running in the way that guilty men run when they see authority in dress uniforms. He moved through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial with the calculated speed of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen, and he was going to delete every trace of it before the paperwork arrived. The investigator arrived at 0847 with a folder and a federal ID. She didn't introduce herself to Brooke. She asked the charge nurse where the night shift ICU nurse was, and when Brooke stepped forward from the medication dispensary, the investigator's eyes went flat. I need you to come with me, she said. Not a request. It wasn't phrased as one either. Brooke followed her down the corridor, past the rooms where she'd spent for nights watching Captain Webb's vitals climb back from the abyss. The investigator walked like a woman who had done this 100 times, escorting people out of buildings, ending careers with the efficiency of someone who didn't need to explain herself. They took the stairs instead of the elevator. No witnesses. By the time they reached the security office on the first floor, Brooke understood what was happening, and she understood that she couldn't explain it. There's been a complaint filed regarding your credentials, the investigator said, opening the folder. An employment gap. Some irregularities in your background check. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending full investigation. You're not to contact hospital staff. You're not to return to this facility. Do you understand? I understand. That was all Brooke said. She didn't argue. She didn't explain that the gap in her service record existed because she'd been ordered by her command to disappear after a black site operation in Ramadi had been buried so deep that officially it had never existed. She didn't mention that her records had been scrubbed, that she'd been told never to surface because the families of the men she couldn't save would be in danger if anyone learned the truth about what had happened in that compound. She didn't say any of it because she couldn't. The moment she started explaining, she would be admitting to things that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide, and those people had ways of making problems disappear more thoroughly than paperwork. The security guard collected her badge. It felt heavier in his hands than it should have. Brooke walked out through the main entrance at 0853, and by 0900, Dr. Sterling had already submitted his statement to the investigator claiming he'd known nothing about her suspicious background, that he'd followed protocol, that he'd acted in the best interest of patient safety. By 10:47, the investigator had recommended her immediate termination. By noon, Oak Creek Memorial had sent her a letter, courier delivered to her apartment, officially severing her employment. The rational thing would have been to stay hidden. To disappear again, like she'd been ordered to do so many years ago. To accept the erasure as the cost of survival. She didn't do that. 72 hours later, Brooke walked into the Denver VA hospital waiting room not as a provider but as a patient. She sat in a plastic chair, surrounded by the same veterans she used to treat, men with missing limbs and invisible wounds, women who understood what it meant to carry scars that nobody could see. She filled out intake forms that had no box for ghosts, no checkbox that said was classified, no space to explain that she existed officially nowhere and everywhere at the same time. A young male nurse called her name. He did a double take when he recognized her. She just nodded and followed him back. Rock bottom felt different than she'd expected. Not the bottom of a vertical fall, more like the floor of a basement you didn't know you'd been descending toward. She sat in the psychiatric evaluation room, talking to a doctor who took careful notes about insomnia and hypervigilance and the specific quality of invisibility that came from being erased by the same government that had asked you to bleed for it. The doctor didn't know she was Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. As far as the paperwork was concerned, she was just another veteran with unexplained gaps and classified service history. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that nobody was coming. Nobody was going to restore her record because nobody could admit that the record had existed in the first place. Nobody was going to defend her because defending her would mean admitting to things that went so far beyond Dr. Sterling's fraudulent billing that the entire military bureaucracy would shake itself apart trying to contain the damage. She was going to spend the rest of her life as a ghost, treated by the VA because that was the only institution authorized to handle ghosts, the official invisible people of the American military. Then the Chinook landed on Oak Creek Memorial's rooftop at dawn on the fourth day, rotors still spinning like a heartbeat that refused to stop. 2 Navy officers in dress uniforms walked through the main entrance at 0603, and within minutes they were in the ICU asking for Senior Chief Sullivan by name and rank. The charge nurse went pale. Dr. Sterling, standing at the medication station, froze with a syringe in his hand. "Did someone say Sullivan?" he asked, and the officer didn't even look at him. Captain Marcus Webb's daughter Emma had been sitting beside his bed since sunrise, doing her homework in the visitor's chair. When the Navy commander entered the room, she stood up instinctively. He handed her a file, official Navy blue, official seal, official weight to it, and told her to read what it said. His voice was steady. Commands were never uncertain. Emma's hands trembled as she opened it. She read aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Citations for Valor in Fallujah. Citations for Valor in Mosul. Bronze Star. Emma paused, swallowing. Bronze Star with Valor. The commander nodded slightly. 1 decoration. Continue. 2nd Bronze Star with Valor. Emma's voice was smaller now, understanding that each word she spoke was rewriting the history of the woman who had saved her father's life. The unit's charge nurse had materialized in the doorway. She watched as Emma kept reading, as the file kept revealing what had been hidden. Purple Heart. Emma's lip quivered. For combat wounds sustained while providing emergency medical care to team members in hostile territory. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, and a Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty while under direct enemy fire in Helmand Province. For pulling 11 wounded men from a burning MRAP vehicle under sustained machine gun fire and providing life-saving care to each of them with complete disregard for her own safety. Emma read the words, and they hung in the air like light after darkness, the kind of light that doesn't fade. Dr. Sterling had gone the color of old bone. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, his uniform so crisp it could have cut glass. "Where is Senior Chief Sullivan?" he asked the charge nurse. And before she could answer, before Sterling could do anything but stand frozen at the medication station, the SEAL added, "We're taking her with us." But they needed to find her first. So the commander left 2 officers at the hospital, coordinating with security and administration, while the SEAL team leader moved toward Dr. Sterling's office. Sterling was already there, hands shaking as he pulled up the security footage system, trying to access the files from 0300 4 days ago, trying to delete the evidence that he'd orchestrated the abandonment of a patient by 15 different doctors, calling them one by one, telling them the case was non-viable, that the nurse was unqualified, that patient safety was at risk. But when he typed in his credentials, the system locked him out. A message appeared, files locked by IT administration. He called down to IT, Voice cracking. This is Dr. Sterling. I need security footage access immediately. The voice that answered was flat. Professional. Dangerous in the way that quiet voices sometimes are. Files are under administrative hold. By whose authority? Sterling's hands were shaking now, visible shaking, fear becoming physical. Mine. This is Marcus Webb, IT Administrator. United States Marine Corps, retired. The name hung there like a grenade with the pin already pulled. I watched everything, Dr. Sterling. I watched the whole sequence. The calls you made. The 15 doctors you convinced to walk away. The way you blocked a nurse from saving a captain when she was the only one left willing to try. I watched every frame. And I saved every single one. Sterling's stomach dropped. You can't. I already did. Uploaded to 3 separate servers. Sent copies to the State Medical Board. Sent copies to CMS. Sent copies to a buddy of mine at the Denver Post. The line went dead. Webb had already disconnected. Webb, who'd watched the whole thing from the security office, who'd recognized in Brooke Sullivan the bearing of a warrior the moment she'd saved Captain Webb's life. Within 2 hours, the State Medical Board called Sterling in for emergency questioning. Within 4, CMS opened a full investigation into 3 years of phantom procedures, inflated claims, kickback arrangements with a medical supply company that Sterling partially owned. Board member Patricia Yates, whose son's DUI conviction Sterling had once helped disappear in exchange for a favorable hospital contract, refused his calls. By evening, the hospital CEO placed him on immediate suspension. Brooke didn't know any of this yet. She was still sitting in the VA waiting room when the Navy officers found her. When the commander approached her chair, she stood without being asked, muscle memory taking over, the kind of reflexive respect that comes from recognizing command authority. Senior Chief Sullivan, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Your commanding officer is asking for you. He paused. So is a 9-year-old girl who wants to say thank you. Brooke had no military authority to refuse. She also didn't want to. The ride back to Oak Creek Memorial took 17 minutes. Riding in the Chinook again, feeling the rotor wash shake her bones the way it used to before she'd been ordered to disappear, Brooke finally let herself breathe. By the time they landed on the hospital rooftop, she understood something had shifted. The air pressure around her had changed. The weight she'd been carrying for so long, the invisibility, the erasure, the official non-existence, was lifting. 6 months later, she stood in Captain Webb's room at Walter Reed, watching him walk with a cane that he wouldn't need for much longer. Emma hugged her again, the 3rd time this week. You saved my dad. You saved him when everyone else said no. Brooke smiled. The first genuine smile in years, the kind that didn't require permission. He's a tough man. Captain Webb gripped her hand with the kind of strength that comes from survival. Senior Chief, you did what 15 doctors refused to do. You risked everything. She had. And the Navy had reinstated her. Not quietly, the story had gone public, had made the Denver Post's front page, had triggered a federal investigation into Oak Creek Memorial's billing practices. Brooke had been offered chief of ICU nursing, but she'd declined. She worked at the Denver VA now, treating the men and women who understood what it meant to serve, what it meant to come back, what it meant to carry invisible scars. Her name was on her badge now. Her rank was visible on her wall. She existed. Driving home, passing through Denver on an afternoon that felt like breathing, she saw a strip mall on Colfax Avenue. Sitting at a folding table under a sun-faded banner that read discount insurance policies, all plans accepted, Dr. Sterling hunched over paperwork in a suit that had probably cost him his last savings. His medical license had been permanently revoked. The fraud investigation had uncovered $2.3 million in false claims. 3 board members had resigned. The hospital had faced a federal fine. And Sterling was selling insurance to people who probably didn't know they were talking to a disgraced doctor, a man whose entire career had collapsed because he'd tried to destroy someone and hadn't realized she was already a legend. Brooke didn't stop her car. She didn't slow down. But she did let herself smile. At the next red light, her hand moved to the 75th Ranger Regiment patch now displayed openly on her jacket, the one that had been sewn into her lining for so long, hidden from the world, a reminder of who she'd been when she was allowed to exist. She thought of the 11 men who'd lived and the 3 who hadn't. She thought of Captain Webb gasping back to consciousness. She thought of Emma's arms around her neck. She thought of Marcus Webb from IT saving footage because he recognized a soldier when he saw one. She thought of a quote she'd heard once, long ago, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." The light turned green. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan drove forward into a life that was finally, completely, undeniably hers. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, or if you've ever seen institutional corruption hurt the people who serve, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. What would you have done in Brooke's position? Would you have stayed silent to survive, or spoken up knowing the cost? Your stories matter. Your voice matters. Thank you for watching.